We're back on the record at 3:23 p.m.
Okay. We're still on this last bullet point. I have a couple more questions. And that's the last bullet point on page 5, Bait stamp 00182. And would you agree with me that a reasonable interpretation of the cited communication is that Mr. Albane gave erroneous information that jeopardized the safety of the flight?
Objection. Certainly I don't agree with that at all. Without having the context of where they were, and I'm assuming on the arrival, going to vertical speed in the descent, it doesn't tell me anything about the circumstances that they were in. All it does is tell me that when, according to whoever made this statement, that they didn't feel that the appropriate thing to do is to go to vertical speed on the descent into Detroit, and as a result of that, they were trying to figure out what was going on.
Okay, now if I can direct your attention to the last bolded subheading, training standard, at the bottom of page 5. You see where I am?
Yes.
Okay. And you don't know, sir, whether there's a requirement under Delta's training manuals to for the pilots to show up 90 minutes prior to the simulator training event?
I know that it's always scheduled for 90 minutes prior.
Okay. Do you know the reason why?
Well, certainly the pilots are being paid for the full session, which includes 90 minutes prior, the 4-hour simulator time, and the 30-minute debrief.
And within those 90 minutes, an oral is conducted?
An oral can be conducted, and as I said, you'll have to talk to Captain Devani about specific requirements.
Okay, well, in the context of this account, where it's reported a training, check airman left a message for the 2 pilots to show up to a recurrent training session 10 minutes prior to that event. Both pilots were new to the aircraft. Both had been on the aircraft less than a year. The captain had failed day 1 and required additional training prior to this event. One of the pilots showed up at the prescribed time and waited for an hour and a half for the instructor. The same instructor did not give the required oral or the walk-around training presentation. FAA approved 90 minutes scheduled. Let me pause there. Did you conduct any investigation as to whether, for the training in question here, whether the Delta's training manuals required an oral prior to the commencement of the simulator check?
What I asked was for the managing director of training to review the situation. However, it's not about the 90 minutes scheduled or not. It's about whether or not the instructor intentionally cut that short and said show up 10 minutes prior to that event. So the concern that I had there was I may have an instructor who is not appropriately following the guidance that we had, and that's when I turned it over to, as I said before, HR, who interviewed the pilots that were in question, because I did get the name of this pilot.
Okay, what was the name of this pilot?
I believe this was Captain Albane.
So you didn't personally investigate this issue?
No.
And no one in the flight department investigated this issue?
Well,
Objection. Flight department?
flight
Yeah.
department, certainly flight training.
Flight training?
Yes.
No, I'm asking, you turned this over, you consider this part of the EO investigation?
For this alleged behavior by this instructor, yes.
Why did you consider this an EO issue?
because of what was being accused. Subsequently falsified training records for the oral that was not given. I mean, that to me is a very serious accusation and needs to be investigated.
And falsifying training records would be a violation of federal aviation regulations as well.
It's a violation of Delta policy, too.
Okay. But the answer is yes, that would be an FAR violation? It's a false.
Yes.
Okay. But the flight department did not conduct an investigation of this issue, correct?
Objection, flight, you keep saying flight department. Is that
Yes.
a defined term?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Did the flight department conduct an investigation of this issue?
Well, it's the training department of flight operations.
Okay, did the training department conduct an investigation?
The training department did not have any specific information that showed that there was an inappropriately conducted simulator. So that's why we needed to go to the instructor himself.
Okay, and and the instructor, you mean Albay?
Yes.
Okay, and when was he interviewed?
I don't know.
By whom was he interviewed?
EO would have that information.
When was he interviewed?
I don't know.
Is it fair to say that the investigation was conducted after the Section 15 referral?
I don't know that I can make that statement. It was. I'm sorry. State it again.
Was the EO investigation of this matter concluded after the March 15th referral?
Yes.
March 17th, you meant, I think, right? You said March 15th, but I think you said March 15th referral.
I meant to say the Section 15 referral.
Yes.
In March.
Yeah.
Okay. And is it acceptable under Delta's training manuals for an instructor to text during a simulator check?
It's not prohibited.
And have you received other reports of instructors texting during simulator checks?
That doesn't typically come to my purview.
Did you conduct any investigation as to whether that's a common practice for instructors to text during simulator checks?
Objection. Badgering. Irrelevant.
There are many reasons for an instructor to have to communicate outside, whether that be to reset a simulator, to get clarification on items that may not be totally known to that instructor at the time. If there is a particular issue that might be raised that the instructor wants to get clarification on. So we don't restrict their communication. We ask them to be professional in nature and ensure that they're conducting the training as prescribed and do the best they can to give appropriate training to the pilots. So I didn't see that as necessarily being out of line. However, if it was in conjunction as a distraction and as a or something that did not allow that instructor to give adequate instruction, then certainly that would be something we wanted to look into, and that's what I asked Captain Tabani to do.
There's no Delta policy that instructors should limit their texting during a simulator check to necessary Delta business?
I think that's implied. I'm not aware that there's a policy.
In what sense is it implied?
Well, we have a policy in the Flight Operations Manual that deals with use of electronics after you run the pre-flight checklist. So as an instructor, certainly that policy would have certain ties to how you are conducting the simulator, and in fact we do allow for operational and other issues to be dealt with by our pilots with electronics in the cockpit, and I can't specifically speak to what was going on in this simulator at the time.
Starting about a third down the second paragraph, it reads, the instructor sat in the back of the simulator and texted the entire session and did not observe the pilots. He did not debrief the pilots, but stated both pilots were to be special tracked. The captain was already required, due to his earlier failure, when a pilot questioned what they had done wrong, he stated, quote, nothing but at Delta we have the power to do what we want, close quote. You understand that Ms. Petitt was talking about her own personal experience in this training event, correct?
Yes, I do.
And that she reported to you that she made an inquiry about what she had done wrong, and that the response came back, nothing but at Delta we have the power to do what we want, and that was part of her experience in the training, correct? In terms of what she reported to you?
In terms of what she reported in this document,
correct.
At this time, that's the first time I'd heard of this, and that's exactly what she reported.
Okay. Would you and did you conclude that Ms. Petitt had made the report about this training event in bad faith?
I can't say that it was made in bad faith. I can't say that it was made with full understanding of the situation either.
Mm. And if a pilot is asked in context of training what they did wrong and get this response, at Delta we have the power to do what we want, would you understand that pilot being anxious going forward?
That's not an adequate response to ever give someone who has not successfully completed a training evolution.
Why is that not adequate?
Because we are required to review the issues or the situation where the pilot was not proficient to be able to be satisfactorily passed. So there is a requirement to be able to talk through that with the pilot and explain what happened. And in fact, as you're entered into special training and checking, there is an additional requirement that you are told what you are coming back to special training and checking for. So we take that information, we put it into the letter and brief the chief pilot, who then briefs the pilot.
And what is, you've referred to a requirement. What's the source of that requirement?
The source is the fact that you're conditionally qualified. In other words, special training and checking does not allow you to go the entire time frame till your next recurrent training. You haven't proven that you are able to be given that full measure before you have to come back and be trained. So special training and checking requires a return visit short of your normal continuing qualification, and as part of that you're required to once again show that you have proficiency in those areas where you were deficient before or marginally proficient before.
Okay, but again, you talk about a requirement. Is the source of the requirement that someone have an explanation of their deficiencies in training? Is that the Delta training manual?
You would have to ask Captain Devani where it is, where it's stated. We have a principles instruction school that every flight training instructor and line check pilot goes through, and I would think that the information would be contained there. I'm not sure where else, but you would have to ask someone running the training department for that specific.
Would you consider it a federal aviation regulatory requirement that there be that explanation of deficiencies after training?
I don't know that I would call it a federal aviation regulation requirement. Certainly that the attitude of the FAA has modified over the years and actually changed to one of compliance philosophy that goes to an idea that you explain what the issue was right at the time. But this is many years ago, and I can't attest to the fact that there was a requirement by the FAA to go into a very detailed debrief right at that time.
Well, certainly there's a general FAR requirement that a carrier train its pilots to the level of proficiency, correct?
Well, there's a proficiency level for the FAA, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
it's called the qualification standard.
okay.
Yeah.
And would you understand the concern of a pilot who emerges from training feeling that he has not been adequately trained?
Oh, certainly.
No. What does it mean to be special tracked?
It means that there is that you didn't perform to a standard that would allow the person giving the check to sign off on your being able to be given the entire time frame between return to the simulator for continuing qualification.
Is that response, at Delta we have the power to do what we want in response to the pilot's inquiries about training deficiencies. Is that compliant with Delta's SMS program?
In the context that I'm assuming that First Officer Petitt wrote this, that this instructor told her directly, we have the power to do what we want, and therefore he didn't have to tell her what the issues were, that's not acceptable.
Not acceptable under the SMS program?
Not acceptable in any way, shape, or form from my aspect as the head of flight operations.
And I was specifically asking in terms of SMS. Would you agree with that? It's not, that response is not compliant with Delta's SMS program?
I don't know that this directly relates to an SMS program. I think it has direct correlation to open, honest, and transparent training, and that the pilot deserves to have information on what they did well and what they did not.
Is risk mitigation part of the SRM program?
Yes.
Risk mitigation. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Is it compliant with the concept of risk mitigation under the SMS program not to tell a pilot in what respect he or she has been deficient in training?
I would think if a pilot left the training session not knowing what they didn't do well enough or what was required, I mean, the pilot is qualified when they leave. They just don't have the opportunity to stay out for the entire time frame. So
Where is this?
certainly there
see it
is in the instructor's mind a concern that is being mitigated by having to return sooner than normal. So from a risk mitigation aspect, certainly we want the instructor to tell the pilot.
If a pilot identifies himself or herself as not being adequately trained, what is Delta's obligation?
Delta's obligation is to convene a flight operations review board and review the circumstances around that, and then determine what action may be necessary, if any.
Okay. Was a flight operations review board ever convened with respect to issues reported by Ms. Petitt?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Did you know who Mike Doyle is?
Yes.
Okay, what's his position?
He is the chief line check pilot for the A350.
Is he sometimes referred to as Popeye?
Yes.
If you could turn to page 8 of Graham Exhibit 4. I'm going to refer you to the last bolded subtitle, report checking event, which reads, said pilot reported the above training event concerning the falsifying of records and texting to 3 employees, schedule manager, and ended up speaking to the fleet training captain, who asked said pilot what pilot wanted in light of this event. Said pilot stated, quote, to return to training immediately to know that I am safe, close quote. The fleet training captain's response was, quote, we don't have time for that. We'll bring you back in 3 months and you can do whatever you want. Text me to remind me. Now, you understand that this also involved Ms. Petitt as the pilot?
Yes.
Okay. And did you investigate this incident?
I investigated by handing it over to EO, who then talked directly to Captain Doyle.
Okay. And would you agree with me that EO had not concluded its investigation of this issue prior to March 17th, 2016?
Yes.
And what was EO's determination with respect to this incident?
They did not find fault in what Captain Doyle, the interaction Captain Doyle had with First Officer Petitt.
And what was the basis for that finding?
Their discussion with Captain Doyle about his understanding of what transpired.
Did you attribute bad faith to Ms. Petitt with respect to the report that I've read under the heading of report checking event?
No.
And you didn't have any concern, or you didn't feel it was important to conclude the investigation of this reported incident prior to your Section 15 determination?
Well, it was being investigated at the time, and as I looked at this, the quote, to return to training immediately to know that I am safe. First Officer Petitt was judged safe, or she never would have left the training. So really, she was set up to come back, as I said, in that shortened time frame. Mm-hmm. So she was current and qualified, and once again, this was several years prior. So the fact that she had been flying, and I hadn't seen any other concerns brought forward with her training after that, or that had been reported to me by anyone as far as her operational performance, I didn't necessarily think that there was an issue to have to conclude this prior to any determination.
As you sit here today, do you have any concerns about Ms. Petitt's proficiency as a professional airline pilot for Delta?
Well, I still have concern over decision making and judgment to a certain degree, yes. And I followed the process appropriately in the Section 15 and wanted a fair and accurate assessment to be done. I think that the process worked. Certainly not without some bumps in the road in terms of I think possibly information exchange and so forth, and there may not be a way to be able to get around that. However, I do feel that it was an accurate and an unbiased and fair assessment, and we went through the appropriate process. So she was returned to flying, but I can certainly say that the result does leave me with a lingering question of decision making from time to time, but
and that's based on the social media and uniform issues and events, public speaking events?
no, more to do, I would say, with letters that have been written since, bringing up the AAURS program and some other things. So
What's the AAURS program?
the upset recovery training.
And so you have some concerns about her mental health based on that?
No, with her ability to execute a procedure that is that has been trained and executed to proficiency in the simulator, and whether or not she totally buys into performance of that. In an emergency situation, the one thing you cannot have is unpredictability, and that's why we go through extensive training in the simulator to ensure that both pilots do react with as high a degree of consistency as we can. So the fact that she did write and had significant concerns in what she brought forward to a program that has been FAA approved and that other pilots are anticipating she will execute to, I do have some concern that she may not be able to execute to that.
So what was the issue she raised in the context of upset recovery training?
It was the way that the program was written and what were the maneuvers to be executed to stabilize the aircraft.
And what was her position?
Her position was that the language that we were using, the four-step process, and the philosophy were flawed. And to put it in her words, we're going to does a flawed program have to end with an airplane crash in order to get Delta's attention?
And what flaws did she identify? Jeez.
Well, first of all, there weren't flaws. In her mind, she didn't feel that we interpreted the program correctly and that the steps that we brought forward were not appropriate. However, we worked with a company that is best renowned in the industry for upset training, and our program was followed step by step with the FAA and approved by the FAA.
So she expressed her view that there was not compliance with the program. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes.
And what program is that?
The upset recovery program.
Okay. And is that's
upset recovery training?
That's an FAA approved program?
Yes, it's a required program by the FAA.
And she went through the training as part of her periodic proficiency check, correct?
She did not when she wrote the letter. She hadn't been exposed to the training at all.
But she has since gone through that training?
I believe so.
Correct. And if she's still flying, she passed that training, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what did she identify as the flaw? She identified a flaw in how Delta interpreted and applied the program?
An objection to the form of the question. You can answer it as you already have.
She had issue with the philosophy behind the steps and what the pilots would do as actions in the event of an upset.
Has the company ever modified the program?
We modified all of our programs as we gain more experience. The upset recovery training is a philosophy to be used, and it's not a single once and trained and we're done evolution. We have to do it over time, and we've seen that through years and years of experience, that you don't just step in and create change through one evolution.
What is a stall in the context of aircraft flight operations?
When a wing no longer generates lift to maintain altitude.
Can an aircraft stall have fatal consequences?
Certainly.
And is training on how to handle a stall a component of Delta's FAA-approved training program?
Yes.
And is stall training specific to each equipment type?
Is it specific?
Yes.
The concept is general. The actual characteristics of the stall are specific to each aircraft.
Okay. And a failure to provide a carrier's pilot with stall training for the aircraft type to which he or she is assigned would be a violation of the FARs, correct?
In the current regulations, that's correct.
When did the regulations which you're referencing, when did those go into effect?
You would have to ask Captain Tavani. He maintains the programs.
If you can turn to page 9 of Graham Exhibit 4. And I'm going to direct your attention to the first of the 3 bullet points at the bottom of the page, which reads, pilot writes a blog post, how to perform a stall recovery to educate other pilots after AF 447, open paren BEA 2012, close paren, was pulled from the ocean due to the fact that this pilot never received stall training on the A330. And my question is, did you understand this bullet point to be asserting that Ms. Petitt herself had not received stall training on the A330?
No, I did not.
So you never asked Ms. Petitt about her training, her stall training as it related to the A330?
I don't specifically recall asking her about her stall training.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that she participated on a blog that was outside of the purview of Delta Airlines, and I had no exposure to that blog or understanding that any of the information on it was true and accurate.
I'm sorry, I didn't. Could you read his answer back, please?
I don't specifically recall asking her about the stall training. I do know that she participated in a outside of the purview of Delta Airlines, and I had no exposure to that blog or understanding that any of the information on it was true and accurate.
So you never, this is a blog related to the fatal accident for Air France Flight 447?
No, I don't know that.
Okay.
All I know is that there was a website or page that A330 pilots went to, and I'm not exactly sure where the blog post came from, if it was part of that or if it was part of her own blog. I'm not sure.
Okay. But you were aware that she had Okay. Were you aware that there were other management pilots who expressed a high opinion of Ms. Petitt's blogs?
No.
We're up to 13? Do you know who Barry Wilbur is?
I'm sorry.
Barry Wilbur, W-I-L-B-U-R.
Yes, I do.
I'm handing you a document we've identified as Graham 13. At the top, it indicates it's an email from Barry Wilbur. And what's his title at Delta?
He's no longer at Delta.
Okay. What would have been his title in December 2010?
I'm not sure if it was director or managing director of flying operations.
And did you receive this email from Barry Wilbur?
This goes back to 2010, but I do believe that, yes, this was sent to me.
Okay.
Or CC'd to me.
Okay. Do you know what green dot references in respect to Airbus flight operations?
No.
Handed you an exhibit that's Bates stamp DLT 10 from Carlene Petitt from Clay McConnell of Airbus Americas, Vice President Communications. Did Delta ever provide you a copy of this email?
I don't recall that they did.
Okay. Were you ever called upon, or did you ever conduct an investigation into whether Ms. Petitt had received adequate A330 stall training?
I didn't conduct an investigation. The stall training is part of the curriculum now, and it's also part of what's, part of the FAA mandate for extended envelope training.
And did you ever, are you aware of anyone else within Delta who may have conducted an investigation as to whether Ms. Petitt received A330 stall training?
I'm not aware of anyone.
I'm going to turn your attention to page 12 of the Exhibit 4.
Yes.
Okay, and direct your attention to the second bolded subtitle, reading processes in aircraft operation must be accurate. Training manuals are in error and continue to be so. The A330 manual, despite notification, stated how to identify a stall on the A330 was through the stick shaker. Even after notification, this error remained in the manuals for well over a year. My question is the stick shaker the appropriate means of addressing an A330 stall?
I don't know. I'm not qualified on the A330.
Did you ever identify the issue that was raised under this subheading, training manuals are in error?
I asked Captain Devani to validate, as well as Captain Sternstein, who was running the fleet teams at the time, the standards department, and take a look at our manuals and validate that we had appropriate information.
Okay, and they got back to you with the results of their investigation concerning A330 manual references to using stick shakers to address an A330 stall?
I wasn't given that specific information. I was told that the manuals were up to date and current.
Okay. Did you ever reach the conclusion that Ms. Petitt had raised this issue in bad faith?
I wouldn't say in bad faith. I would say possibly not with full understanding of what may have been identified for this aircraft. In other words, when a manual is presented, there are things that change in the manual. There are also items that may not be 100% accurate that are then updated through bulletin. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't understand was whether or not she had referenced all that information or not, which is the reason I asked Captain Devani and Captain Sternstein to look into it. Well,
did they ever tell you that Ms. Petitt was mistaken in what she said here?
I didn't ask them that question.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to turn to page 13, the next page. Referencing process of training pilots, subheading 2010 training process failures from one particular pilot exemplifies process failures through the entire training program. Appendix J, first bullet point is not providing training materials until the final hour prior to training. Is that consistent with Delta's training manuals to not provide training materials until the final hour prior to training?
No.
And did you, is this something that you assigned to Mr. Devani to investigate?
To Captain Devani and Captain Sternstein.
Okay. And did they reported back to you what?
They reiterated what the policy was on providing manuals and the training experience.
Did you ever ask Ms. Petitt the specifics as to when this happened in terms of the allegation of not providing training materials until the final hour prior to training?
No, I didn't.
Did Mr. Tavani or, I'm sorry, the other gentleman's name was Sternstein?
Sternstein?
Okay, did you know if they ever interviewed Ms. Petitt in terms of when the alleged incident occurred?
I don't know.
Did you ever conclude that Ms. Petitt had reported this first bullet point allegation in bad faith?
Once again, not intentional bad faith, I think possibly sensationalized. Not providing training materials until the final hour prior to training would indicate that before she started her training, 1 hour prior, she would have been given material and said, you're going to step in to a training program in 1 hour and have to start going through your systems validation. And that certainly did not pass the reasonable man theory test. So, but I do understand the meaning that if it's arriving late, or what is perceived as late in her mind, that there could be a better way to do business.
Or are you saying this was such a serious deficiency in training protocol that you simply could not believe it to be true?
I was told that it was not true.
You were told it was
By
not?
Captain Tavani and Captain Sternstein in their report. They said, no, this is when we deliver the training materials. Here's when it's available. And I don't remember specifics on it, but it certainly was not the final hour prior to training.
But they told you what the policy was, correct?
Yes.
They never conducted. Isn't it true that they never conducted an investigation as to whether the incident that Ms. Petitt reported had occurred that day or not?
Objection. What day?
I didn't ask them to specifically review her circumstance. What I asked them to do was to review what is our policy and our procedure for distributing the training and essentially handling all the rest of these points.
Okay. Now, if you look at that heading, it says 2010 Appendix J. Did you ever read Appendix J?
I would have to take a look to understand what Appendix
So why don't you
J
turn to
is.
page 30 and 31.
Just page 31.
Yeah. Yes. Do you recall this appendix, Jay?
I don't recall specifically reading this,
Okay.
but if it was part of the report, I did reference it.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Tavani or Mr. Sternstein to review Appendix J?
I don't recall.
If you could turn to page 16 of the report, and well, tell me, yeah, you there? So there's a subheading in bold: Captain Emergency. Shortly after departure, a flight lost their auto flight system. The captain continued to fly to Atlanta. He requested a block altitude and flew in RVSM airspace. Then, open paren, upon arrival, not when the issue began, close paren, he declared an emergency because ATC would not provide a block altitude for the arrival phase. The training department used this as an example of workload management and created a video. My question, my first question is, what does RVSM stand for?
Reduced vertical separation.
What is the required equipment for flying in RVSM?
I would have to take a look at my manual.
Does the account reported that I just quoted, does that cause any concern to you?
Well, the flight in RVSM airspace, depending on the aircraft, I believe requires an auto-flight system. So the question was it a total loss of the auto-flight system or a degradation of the system? And then the second would be, did air traffic control, after being advised of that, allow them to stay in RVSM airspace?
And could you describe your investigation into this reported incident?
I don't recall.
Okay. Do you recall reviewing the video that was referenced?
No.
Do you recall assigning the investigation of this incident to anybody else?
Yes.
Okay. To whom?
Captain Devani and Captain
Okay.
Sternstein.
And do you recall what they reported back to you?
Well, this contains several pieces, as I recall. So it was, Captain Emergency is a pretty broad subject, and this bounces around from equipment that you might need in RVSM airspace to hand flying the aircraft to workload management. And essentially, I had a hard time understanding where we were going with this whole thing. So I asked them to step in and take a look at captain's authority, captain's ability to declare an emergency, what our guidance was on emergencies, and time bucket, no time bucket, how had we trained that, and they reviewed our procedures and policies with respect to that.
What did they report back to you?
That they felt that we were in compliance and had appropriately educated our pilots on emergency declaration and captain's authority.
And when did they report that to you?
It would have been subsequent to First Officer Petitt's presentation to the head of training, the head of standards, and the head of flight safety.
Was it before or after your Section 15 referral?
I'm assuming it would be after.
And isn't it true that Ms. Petitt told you that Captain Dempsey was the pilot involved in this incident?
Yes, she did.
Did you ever talk to Captain Dempsey about this incident?
Actually, Captain Dempsey approached me.
Oh. When did he approach you?
Shortly before the presentation that First Officer Petitt gave.
Okay, and what did he say to you?
He said that the way that the situation was characterized did not reflect the actual, the way that First Officer Petitt characterized the situation did not accurately reflect what happened and nor the intent.
Okay, in what respects?
Just that he felt like she had mischaracterized it.
But do you recall any of the specifics in terms of the supposed mischaracterization?
I didn't delve into that because she was about to make a presentation to discuss this.
Well, did you
with
ever
them.
conclude, well, did Captain Dempsey respond to Ms. Petitt's presentation to the extent it addressed this incident?
I was not in the room at the time. I understand that that there was a back and forth about the situation, but I don't know the specifics of that discussion.
Okay, did you ever conclude that Ms. Petitt had reported this incident in bad faith?
Once again, I can't say that she submitted this in bad faith. I can also not say that she accurately reported the situation. Because I had the person who experienced it firsthand tell me what happened, and it was not accurate.
But you have no recollection with respect to what elements were inaccurate?
Not at this time, no.
If you have an emergency on an aircraft on departure at an airport suitable for landing, do you continue to destination or return to the airport from which you departed?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If you have an emergency on an aircraft on departure at an airport that would be suitable for landing, return and landing, do you continue to destination or do you return to your airport of origin?
I don't have near enough information to answer that question.
Okay. You don't know whether there's a general practice that generally prevails?
Not with that open-ended question, no.
Is hand flying an emergency procedure?
No.
Is it a pilot required to declare an emergency with ATC?
It depends on the situation.
Would you agree that's the general practice, that a pilot must declare an emergency with ATC if circumstances don't preclude him from doing so?
A pilot determines when it's appropriate to declare an emergency with ATC, and pilot makes that decision. That's what captain's authority is all about.
Okay. If an emergency is declared, should the pilot, generally speaking, land at the first suitable airport?
Not necessarily.
Under what circumstances would he forego a proximate suitable airport and proceed to his final destination?
There are many times when that could be the case. It depends on the weather at the departure airport. It depends on the equipment that's available. Unsafe gear up comes to mind. If you are in a position that that you know that you're going to have to burn down fuel in order to be light enough to land the aircraft, then if you're flying between Atlanta and Orlando, Do you stay right over Atlanta and burn down that aircraft, or do you continue to Orlando? You're going to have to declare an emergency either way once you drop the gear. So there are certainly circumstances where you could continue. And actually, we use a process called the RAM process that allows the captain to contact our operations control center and bring subject matter experts into the decision. So a captain, unless they are directed by the QRH to land immediately or through their emergency procedures, if they deem that there is something that they think that they want to continue on for, we ask that they convene the RAM process, and we bring in our subject matter experts and assess everything to allow them to continue or not.
You're familiar with the expression suitable airport?
I am.
Okay. What does suitable mean to you?
Well, suitable versus immediate. Suitable would be an airport that that you could land and feel comfortable that you had the appropriate firefighting equipment as well as an ability to have the airplane handled.
Do the FARs provide for flight duty maximums for pilots?
Yes, they do.
What are those maximums?
They are all stated in FAR 117, and it depends on the time of day that you start your duty and finish your duty, and I would have to reference a specific table to give you that information.
Okay. Well, what hours count toward those maximums?
Your time on duty.
And would you agree that this is a regulation designed to promote operational safety?
Yes.
Okay. Has Delta ever scheduled its pilots in a manner that violates 117?
Not intentionally.
Okay. Has Delta inadvertently violated 117?
It depends on what part of 117 you're talking about. In terms of going past your duty day, there are certain incidents that have occurred at Delta. Those are all required to be reported to the FAA, and we do that religiously. So does every airline out there.
Okay. Do you have any recollection of 117 violations in the last 2 years that were brought to your attention?
After every irregular operation, one of the first things we look at are potential 117 violations. And I have a team that looks at those.
Okay. And so I'm asking, have any incidents been brought to your attention in the last 2 years?
Yes.
Okay. And can you recall any of them?
Not specifics, but typically we don't talk about specific incidents. They're handled at the operational level, and a review is done to determine what were the circumstances involved and what were the decisions made up to that point that put us in the situation where the 117 duty day was not adhered to.
Okay. So as you sit here today, you can't recall a single incident involving a FAR 117 violation in the last 2 years?
Nothing specific comes to mind.
And are you familiar with the term deadhead?
Yes.
What does that term mean?
Well, deadhead is a term used when we're trying to position a pilot for a subsequent flight.
Okay, and do deadhead hours count toward rest or duty?
Yes.
Okay. When do deadhead hours count as duty hours?
Deadhead hours count whenever you are inside the rotation.
Okay. So that would include a deadhead to position a pilot for a subsequent flight?
Well, it depends on if you're referring to deadhead or commuting.
Well, I'm referring to deadhead.
Well, there are two schools of thought, and the FAA says that that deadhead on the front end of the rotation may not be considered duty. However, there are certain times when it can be considered duty. So it's subject to interpretation, and there are several interpretations of FAR 117. So without understanding exactly what situation you're talking about with deadhead, I can't answer that.
Well, you said there are two schools of thought. What are the two schools of thought?
Well, the schools of thought are that in a particular situation, Deadheading should certainly be considered as part of the overall duty day before a pilot would start. The other school of thought that has been brought forward from well, I'm just going to say ALPA's point of view is that the Delta Alpha group has given me indication that they do not believe that deadhead should be considered part of duty day on the front end of a rotation.
Well, what's the source of the first school of thought?
Well, I can tell you that I don't agree with the fact that it should not be considered part of the deadhead.
And
I mean, part of the duty day.
And what is the FAA's position?
Well, the FAA does not make a determination in this with distinction.
So
in other words, they don't answer the question with 100% authority on what it should be considered, nor do they want to enter into that discussion.
So you're saying, to create a hypothetical, a pilot is deadheaded from Chicago to New York, flying from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., and then flies a trip at 8 p.m. from New York to Paris. The FAA has no position as to whether a deadhead in that context would count as duty time?
Well, depending on how the rotation is built, if the pilot deviates from the scheduled rotation, then they would say that they will not weigh in to determine whether or not that's duty day. If the pilot is in Chicago on an overnight and then deadheads and then proceeds, then it certainly is considered part of the duty day.
And isn't it true that on January 28th, at the January 28th, 2016 meeting, that Ms. Petitt advised you that one of Delta's scheduling practices violated FAR Part 117?
She said that she had a situation that she had knowledge of. She did not give me a date or a pilot or a rotation that I could go back and validate what her concern was. I can tell you that my thought on what she brought forward, if it were in fact true, that the pilot had deadheaded in, and once again, this is not a scheduled Delta deadhead that said that they would deadhead to a point and then immediately get on an aircraft and fly back as prescribed and the rotation is built. That should never have happened. And that is on crew scheduling if that happens. We should never have set it up that way. If the pilot deviated from deadhead, and let's say that that particular rotation went from Seattle to Hong Kong and came back, the pilot lived in Los Angeles and said, I'm going to fly myself from Los Angeles to Hong Kong, and I can make a positive space seat to do that according to the contract and get in just in time to then fly that aircraft back, that pilot is in violation of our policy, and that should, or in violation of 117 in my estimation, and that should never happen.
Do you know if Delta, after the January 28th meeting, did Delta ever engage in any investigation of its scheduling practices to see if this was a continuing practice of improperly discounting deadhead from duty hours?
First of all, you're assuming that it was Delta scheduling that had made that error, and that's not the case. There was no way to validate that, but what I can tell you is certainly we did take a look at our policies and our practices with how we were scheduling our pilots.
And who undertook that?
That was Tim Hennieroed.
Could you spell that name?
Hennieroed.
And what is his title?
Managing Director, Crew Scheduling.
And that, and when was he directed to engage in his review?
That is an ongoing review that we have happening.
Okay, but
As part of our fatigue risk management program and as part of our review of all of our rotations prior to being published. We look for any 117 violations. We actually have something called the flight crew legalities engine that we run all of our rotations through to ensure that they are compliant with FAR 117.
And that's ongoing? You can't fix a date when that kind of review commenced?
I'm sorry, are you filming me?
No.
If you don't mind, just point that the other way, please.
So do you know when that review commenced?
I do not.
Okay. I've passed to you a document that's been identified as Graham Exhibit 15. It's a letter dated September 8th, 2016 on FAA letterhead from Vincent L. Murray II, Manager Audit and Analysis Branch. The first paragraph after the salutation, Dear Ms. Petitt, reads, the FAA's Flight Standards Service has completed their investigation of your air carrier safety allegations in case number EWB 16637. The investigation substantiated that a violation of an order, regulation, or standard of the FAA related to air carrier safety occurred. Accordingly, the FAA is taking appropriate corrective and/or enforcement action. Our office will monitor these actions until complete. So my question is, did you ever get a copy of this September 8th, 2016 letter?
I did not.
Do you have any knowledge as to the violation of an order, regulation, or standard of the FAA related to air carrier safety that was substantiated by the FAA?
I have no knowledge.
Sorry.
She's just-
her filming on that?
No, she's texting.
Okay.
So long as it...
I wasn't looking, but I
No, yeah.
didn't see what happened, but can you just confirm that there's been no filming of the witness? I heard you.
Or
She's
pictures
texting.
or
Or
anything.
photos or anything? I mean, do you mind, I mean, no, I don't want you, you can text all you want, but can the attorney just look at your phone and make
Sure.
sure that there are no photos? You just open up the photo app, and then everybody will be more comfortable, I think. I take your word.
No.
But I trust Mr. Siam's
Okay.
word of honor,
Thank
of
you.
course. I wasn't paying attention to
Okay.
that, but obviously. Thank you.
Yeah, so long as that's, the momentum has been broken a little bit, maybe we could take a 5-minute break, or whatever break you'd like.
Okay, we're getting relatively close to.
We're off the record at 4:36 p.m.